The vet. When the night is cold and freezing wet, that's the time to call your local vet. It was 2:30 and he'd just got to bed. He'd been doctoring a horse in a leaky old shed. There'd be no sleep for him this night, he knew. Mrs. Murphy just called, said her cow was a month overdue. She said old Blossom's in a lot of pain and I can't seem to get her in out of the rain. So he put on his clothes and jumped in his truck. He could picture the old cow laying out there in the muck. He drove right along out to the Murphy farm, and he found old Blossom laying out behind the barn. He slipped his cold old boots upon his feet. The manure in that krell was at least 2 foot deep. He was miserable and cold, but he still had to laugh when Mrs. Murphy said, "Hurry, or she may lose her calf." He could see a couple of feet showing. The rain came down, the wind was a-blowing. He had to get down in all that muck 'cause that calf was really stuck. The calf bawled and old Blossom mooed. They'd both be all right, this he knew. And as he carried that calf to the barn, he was wondering yet just how come he decided to be a vet. This is a Halloween poem called "The Night the Ghost Got Goosed." All my troubles started 30 years ago or more, all on account of an old sheet in a closet behind the door. It was Halloween night, and I thought I'd have some fun. I figured I'd go out and trick-or-treat with the little ones. Oh, yes, I'd need a costume. Why hadn't I thought of this before? And then I remembered seeing this old sheet in the closet behind the door. I cut 2 holes for my eyes, another one so I could breathe. Then I cut a hole in each side. This was to be the sleeves. Now it had been raining for about a week. I thought my legs would freeze, 'cause I was taller than the rest. I had to walk on my knees. We came to this one house. I wished we'd never rung that bell. That old girl was an old battle axe, that was plain to tell. She came with some little old hard candies. They didn't amount to a hill of beans. And when she was putting them in the sacks, she kept a-looking over at me. And boy, what I mean, she looked at me hard. She said, "You don't need any candy, you big tub of lard." She came with an old dried-up lemon and put it in my sack. And then the next thing I knew, she'd went around to the back. Now, I've always had trouble with my big feet, and sure enough, they were sticking out from underneath that sheet. She grabbed an old mop stick and started beating me on the back side. Of course, I was trying to get away and find a place to hide. But would you believe it, both my feet had gone to sleep, and on top of that, I was all tangled up in that blame sheet. Well, she kept beating on me and trying to see my face, and the way she used that mop stick was really a disgrace. But I finally jerked away once I got on my feet, and all she got for her troubles was a handful of sheet. When I got home, the missus sure was mad. Seems as though that was her best linen sheet, in fact, the only one she had. Now, anyone not believing me and thinks that this is a lie that I might tell can come and look at that old sheet. It's now tore all to hell. For every Halloween night for 30 years or more, I've had to roll up in that old sheet and sleep behind the kitchen door. This poem is called "Give Me That." You can talk about faraway places and the many people you have seen, and about the great cities where the air is never clean, or the roar of a factory, or the clang of a subway train, the shuffle of many feet as the day's work's done again. With the red lights flashing and cars going everywhere, where people don't know their neighbor or don't even seem to care. Some live in just 2 rooms in an apartment or flat. The kids are out playing. They don't know where they're at. Give me the open country where the air is pure and clean. Give me a drink of water from a cold mountain stream. A grassy knoll by a meadow with the smell of new-mown hay. A place where man can dream at the end of a hard day. Let me see the wild flowers and hear the hum of the bees, and hear the chatter of the squirrel from a grove of pine trees. Let my neighbor call on me, and of him I'll do the same. Let me fish in the meadow brook and hunt the wild game. I don't need much money, no happiness will this bring. Just give me the open spaces, that is everything. The Volkswagen. I'd like to tell you a story, but I don't know where to begin. It's about 4 heavy-set ladies in one little Volkswagen. They all finally got in. You should have seen that thing squat. I was sitting behind the wheel, but I didn't know if I could drive or not. I finally found the gear shift and got it into gear. We were going out dancing and maybe drink a little beer. Now this is a good little car. It usually runs just fine. But this time it just sat there till I made that motor whine. But it finally started to move. It acted like a sick cat. I knew without a doubt the tires must all be flat. We finally got out on the highway and I shifted it up a gear or two. The poor little thing trembled and shook. It was under great strain, I knew. A patrolman came along and he just nodded his head. If everyone drove that slow and careful, no one would be dead. It wasn't because I was so smart that I was driving that slow. I had my foot right on the floor, but that's as fast as she would go. Now the next time I want to go out dancing or maybe on a spree, I'll pick up a load of heavy women and take 'em along with me. This poem's called Old Indian. Old Indian, 103, lived all alone in a big teepee. Newspaper man wonders why Indian lives so long and never die. So says he the thing to do is ask him for an interview. Tell me, Chief, if you can, why such a long lifespan? Indian sits long time before he speak, pretty old and kind of weak. Indian live good clean life, got no papooses, got no wife. Never smoke, drink, or chew, all bad things other Indians do. Eat lots of fish and Indian corn, have bowel movement at 8 every morn. Remarkable, newspaper man say, glad I interview you today. Not so good, old Indian say, get up 9 o'clock each day. That terrible man. Just through with the feast was this timber beast. He dined on mulligan stew. He hitched up his pants and wiped off his chin, and he headed for the Dewdrop Inn. His cork boots threw sparks as he walked there in the dark. His shirt was torn half in two. He reached in his pocket for his Copenhagen box and took another big chew. Although bone-tired, he had a terrible thirst, and he could hear this music play. He lengthened his stride 'cause he had no ride, and he shouldered his way through the door. As he stood there by the bar, he could hear these guitars a-playing a rollicking tune. He let out a yell like a tree being fell, or a husky howling at the moon. He downed 4 double shots, washed them down with beer, and he grabbed a girl that stood near. Well, the splinters just flew as he spit out his chew, and he'd ruined that floor we all knew. But he wished he'd never been born when he stepped on her corn, and she belted him one in the snoot. Now Tamarack Joe never goes anywhere wearing his cork boots. TV commercials. Sometimes I stop and wonder just how many rehearsals it must take to put on one of these TV commercials. They advertise this and they advertise that, things to make you skinny and things to make you fat. They have pills to make you sleepy and pills to keep you awake, and 1,000 other kinds that everyone should take. Now all of these are supposed to be good for you and me, pills for your belly and for irregularity. I'd like to know how many pills there are in this nation. Even have pills to hold down the population. They also have pills that keep you on the run, and they're going to be short of toilet tissue before they are done. They have some pills that are supposed to make you big and stout, pills for your liver, and pills for the gout. They have pills that are supposed to pep you up, pills for your cat and pills for your pup. There's some pills that make you lose your breath, and some so doggone big they'll choke you to death. Now if you listen to all these commercials, you must be very brave, but if you were to try them all, you'd end up in an early grave. Joe de Trapper. My name be Joe de Trapper, half French, half Cree. Live way down in canyon, where no one bother me. My only friends Indians, some of dying race. Only company dog, me call him Fuzzy Face. He one big Airedale I get in Montreal, about 150 pounds, about 2 foot tall. Something wrong with Fuzzy Face, him acting kind of sick. I think maybe he get bit by a spotted fever tick. Yesterday I give him herbs, he drink water like craze. Today he no lift up his head, just kind of lays. I think I go find Medicine Man up by Moose Jaw Lake. Maybe dog well again he make. Better start pretty soon, take me all day I think. So I give dog plenty of water so he get a drink. Joe make real good time by noon teepees I see. This camp of Wolfpaw and other Cree. Joe tells him trouble, dog very sick. Medicine Man fishing down by the creek. Medicine Man listen, he answer by and by. Go home eat dog before he die. This make Joe pretty mad, eat dog big disgrace. I tell Wolfpaw go to L right to his face. I tell Medicine Man, he one big squaw. He come down by my way, I call in the law. They all cussin' me as I get in canoe. Indian kid shoot Joe in rear with arrow, nothing Joe can do. I get home, get arrow out, that blame kid pretty stout, but Joe's dog all better, him running about. The Railroad Bum. The old days are gone forever. They'll never come back. The day of the railroad bum in the old jungle shack. It was late in the fall of '32, on a cold and dreary night. From out of the east there came a freight train. We could see the big light. As it pulled a grade with drivers slippin' and a stack belchin' smoke, from a pellet on the cold floor the old man awoke. He laid there in the gloom of that old cabin while the whistle blew. He'd been sick for several days, and he was about through. He turned to me with a haggard face and a smile crossed his lips. Said he'd run that old engine a good many trips. He'd been an engineer out of Williston a long time ago, and that's where he'd had a wreck in the blinding snow. It was the dispatcher's fault, but the railroad does some funny things. And the dispatcher had relatives who pulled a lot of strings. So here he sat with an awful cold deep in his chest. He couldn't even catch that train that was headed for the west. He pulled the blankets closer as a chill went up his spine. He only had 2, and one of them was mine. I built up the fire and heated a pot of stew and warmed the old coffee can that held a potent brew. He tried to drink a little coffee, but he choked and fell back and laid there listening to that train as it went on down the track. He said, "Lad, it's been almost 30 years since I made that slip. I'd like to make it to the coast, but I'll never stand the trip." He said, "I have a daughter who lives down California way. You'll find her in the suburbs, just out of L.A. I wish you'd give her my pack sack, which is all I really own, and tell her you were with me and I didn't die alone." I watched over him all that night, and he died just at dawn, and I felt pretty lonesome when I realized he was gone. I put him in a shallow grave beside the railroad track, and I caught the next train for the coast and took along his pack. I went to see his daughter down by L.A., and she invited me in for dinner, but I didn't want to stay. My clothes were pretty dirty, and there was cold soot ground in my hide. I told her I was just a railroad bum, but I did have some pride. She showed me a picture that hung there on their wall, about 3 foot long and about 2 foot tall. The picture was a locomotive sitting on the track, and the buffalo crossing, the herd that never came back. You could see the engineer with his head sticking out, watching that great herd as it moved towards the south. The engineer was her daddy, that was plain to see, and the date on that picture was 1883. At the bottom of that picture, these words I clearly read: compliments of Jim Hill to a damn good hog head. This poem is called Hobo Pete's Last Ride. I always figure this was probably one of my best poems that I've ever written. During the Great Depression, when work was so slack, there was a hobo jungle just down from the railroad track, where a great river tumbled with its waters clear and blue. You could smell the coffee boiling. You could also smell the stew. It was here the hobos gathered. It was here they swapped their yarns. Some came from great cities. Others came from farms. Some were old and feeble. Others they were young. Some talked about the future. Others about things they'd done. One evening in September, when the sun was sinking low, from out of the west there came a freight train. We could hear the whistle blow. As it pulled up to the siding and they stopped to throw the switch, a hobo come out of a boxcar and gently hit the ditch. He came down to the jungle with his pack-sack on his back. He says, "Boys, is there anything to eat? My belly's kind of slack." We said, "Well, there's coffee there and there's beans in the pot. I guess there's no bread left. I suppose that's all we've got." He said, "Now that'll be a plenty. What more could a man ask for? I've seen the days when I ate nothing, and I suppose I'll see some more." After he'd eaten, he scoured the dishes all up good. He leaned back against his pack-sack and fed the fire a little wood. Then he rolled a cigarette and passed the makings all around. He had a look of contentment as he sat there on the ground. Then he took from his pack an old banjo and tuned it up a bit. A pick for each finger he took from a little kit. We all moved up closer and took ourselves a seat. We could see the words on that banjo, Hobo Pete. And then his fingers started to move. God, how that man could play. And a song came from his lips. It was the song of the day. Even the night birds stopped to listen. There was no sound at all. As Hobo Pete sang about a train, it was the Wabash Cannonball. You could hear that train whistle. You could hear those hobos call. It was almost as though you'd took a trip on the Wabash Cannonball. You could hear the rattle and you could hear the roar as it crossed that old mountain and came down the valley floor. After he had finished, everyone sat looking at the fire glow, while Hobo Pete told us a story about his younger days, you know. He'd had a little farm there on the Wabash where that great train still run. He had a beautiful wife and 4 small young ones. It was here he'd raised cotton. He'd also raised some corn. His daddy'd been a farmer, and he was a farmer since he was born. One day he'd went to the grist mill to get some corn ground. When he came home, this note was all he found. "I'm taking the children and going far away. I'm leaving with a banjo picker by the name of Monty Clay. There's no use looking for us. You'll just be wasting your time. God, she must have forgot those little kids were half mine." Now that was 30 years ago, and I've been everywhere. And I still love that woman, but why'd she treat me so unfair? I learned to pick a banjo. I can play most any tune. And every fall I go back to the Wabash, where I'll be going soon. I sit there in my cabin and play the time away. Maybe she will hear me and come back to me someday. My kids, of course, are all grown up and married, I suppose. God, how I'd like to see 'em. It's been hell, you know. I've been in every freight yard. I've searched in every town. I've been in every gambling joint and every jail around. I've been to Canada and Mexico. I've been to Florida and Maine. I've even eaten from garbage cans and slept out in the rain. That fall he was going back home in the sleet and the rain, when his numb hands slipped off the rods of that great train. They buried him there by his cabin, where he could hear the whistle blow, and in the grave beside him they put his broken banjo. At the head of the grave they put a tombstone, and here the hobos all meet. These words are carved upon it: "Here lies Hobo Pete." This poem is called Miss McNally. It was getting towards fall, and we'd had lots of rain, and the circus came into town on a train. Us kids were down by the tracks with some other loiters and found out they were headed for the winter quarters. Well, the track had washed out somewhere up the line, and they had to unload and spend some time. They pitched their tents just outside of town. There was a lot of us kids a-hanging around. It was miserable weather and still lots of rain. It was 3 or 4 days before they got back on the train. They were loading up in an awful rush, and one old elephant sneaked off in the brush. After they were gone, he came back into town, ate up a few gardens, and went and laid down. The next morning it was so foggy you could hardly see. Miss McNally was up having her cup of tea. She looked out her window and was really surprised. There in her garden was an animal of tremendous size. She dropped her cup and rushed to the phone. Being an old maid, she lived all alone. She called the police and the firemen too and said, "Come quick, I don't know what to do. There's an animal in my garden as big as a house, and he's pulling up my cabbages I was saving for kraut." She said, "He's pulling them up with his tail," and then her voice began to fail. She said, "You better bring all your men, 'cause they're not going to believe what he's doing with them." This poem is called "Would You Be Him?" Last year I saw Santa Claus when he came to our place. But he wasn't his usual jolly self. He wore a frown upon his face. Said he'd had a terrible time. Old Rudolph had ran away, and all he had was a dim flashlight to try and guide his sleigh. He said I had a time tonight to even get on my sled. My rheumatism's been bothering me so I spent most of the year in bed. First place I came to tonight, I sized up the chimney good. Everyone's using oil and gas, no one's burning wood. Next I came to a big tall house. I knew I couldn't get on top, so I said too bad for them, and I didn't even stop. Next I came to a bungalow. Now this looked pretty good. The siding was made of the slickest stuff. Why, it wasn't even wood. I got halfway up and come tumbling down. I wish I had been ready, because I lit on a cement walk right square on my belly. Next I came to a farmhouse. I knew I wasn't in town, because I could smell a pig pen and there was cattle lying around. I parked my sleigh and started creeping up to the house. My pack was nearly full. Now how was I to know they'd have a mean bull? But I finally made it up on the house and sized up the chimney, and I knew this would be quite a trick. And when I got halfway down, I got hit on the head with a brick. I finally made it the rest of the way down and started looking for the fireplace. And what did I find but a little round stovepipe hole staring me in the face? I ranted and raved and banged around and woke up the whole place. They brought a rope and hauled me out and wiped the soot off my face. I gave 'em about half my stuff, trying to lighten my pack. They said you better go out the front door, not to try the back. By this time I was getting mad, and I just didn't give a rip. I headed out the back door, and over a mad dog I tripped. The dog got up and grabbed me, and the flannel it just flew. Why, he had the whole seat of my pants by the breezes, how I knew. I made a dash for my sleigh. That bull had been forgot. And all at once here he come, and my stomach tied in a knot. I grabbed the pack off my back and threw it with all my might. It landed on the bull's horns, and I sped through the night. Now if you got missed last Christmas and you're feeling kind of low, just think of poor old Santa Claus walking clear back to the North Pole. This poem's called "O Guntry's Goat." O Guntry's Goat. The Pat O'Guntrys lived out in the country. They had a whole passel of kids. Some they were married, and some they still carried. That is, Mrs. O'Guntry did. They raised lots of goats for milk in their coats, and they left their neighbors alone. They built their fences up high. At least they would try to keep all those goats at home. Now they had an old Billy. This may sound silly, but he was as big as a horse. He was ornery and mean, the worst you have seen, and no fence would hold him, of course. One day they weren't around, and he went into town, and he pranced up and down the street. Now Mrs. O'Toole, who teaches in school, had went uptown to get groceries and meat. She was tripping along, humming a song. Not a worry was there on her mind, when old Billy spied her and slipped up behind her with her groceries piled up so high. Well, she heard a patter, but she didn't know what was the matter, and she couldn't see where she had been. When old Billy hit her, it made quite a litter, and it was quite a sight for the men. Her legs felt like jelly as she laid there on her belly, and she thought the wind had all left her for good. But she finally sucked in some air and covered up where she was bare and got up as soon as she could. She found a dog had taken her slab of bacon, and her eggs were scrambled for shore. And amongst all that clutter she was looking for her butter and pinning up her dress that was tore. Well, she heard a bleat, and she looked up the street, and here came that goat once more. Although she was weakly, she sidestepped him neatly, and he didn't do what he'd done before. When he went by, she let out a cry and grabbed him by the horns. Well, he didn't know the source, but he was steered off his course, and his book of knowledge got torn. He run into a street light with all his might. This shook him clear down to his toes. He staggered around a couple times, he fell down. He knows not where he goes. Now a big truck from the east run over the beast. This done poor Billy in, they say. The old Guntrys came around, but no sign of him was found. They know not what happened to old Billy this day. Hard Luck McLean. Strange tales have been told of the search for gold in that land around the pole. Brave men have died, been cast aside, and some without a soul. One man stood out among the rest. This man had a heart of gold. He dug in the muck and broke the tuft of the tundra when it was froze. Though he never complained, though it was plain this man was born to fail, he was always the first in spring and the last in the fall to mush the Dawson Trail. He never gave up in his search for the yellow stuff, no matter how hungry he got. He'd just joke, the jolly bloke, though his belly was tied in a knot. He'd sing a song as he mushed along to some forgotten claim. Everyone knew him in the frozen north, though he was a man without any fame. Now it was New Year's Eve, and we were having a ball in the Tenderloin Saloon. The northern lights were shining bright, and there was a pale aurora moon. The logs had cracked in the walls of my shack. It was danged awful cold. Old-timers claimed and all agreed it was 75 below. At the stroke of 12, someone yelled, and they tapped another keg, and we offered a toast to what we thought was a ghost, to Hard Luck Mike McLean. Then someone raised a hand, and the place went still. We heard the yip of a dog-sled team. From out of the north down Bonanza Street came this man Hard Luck McLean. He swayed in his stride, and nothing but pride kept him from falling head first in the snow. How he stayed on his feet all the way down that street was a thing that nobody knows. He fell by the door, and we stretched him out on the floor and removed his parka and hood. He was frosted clear through from head to toe, and he sure didn't look good. Although he was beat, he tried to get to his feet. He was talking about his dogs and gold. We took care of his team, and like men in a dream, we started unloading that sleigh. It was loaded with gold, and down in the hold there was nuggets as big as eggs. We weighed the stuff, and sure enough, there was $250,000 in gold. He raved in his sleep, though his voice was weak. He told us about that strike. It was the last of June, and the flowers were in bloom, and the sun shone all the day. He'd stopped under a tree when a rainstorm came, and waited for it to go. And when a rainbow showed, there he knowed where he'd stake his last claim. There at the end, where the rainbow bends, this muskeg swamp could be seen. He dug through the crust of the goopy mush until there came a fall freeze. Then he dug some more till he was weary and sore, and his grub was nearly gone. He'd have to leave in a day or so. The cold was getting into his bones. But being a stubborn man, he dug and he panned until at last bedrock showed. And there on the floor of that muskeg lore was a treasure like few men had seen. He died that night in his sleep as we sat quietly by his side. He woke up once and grabbed me by the hand and gave it a gentle squeeze. He said, "Now, Joe, you take my gold and use whatever you need. Send the rest home to my folks who are old and bury me up by my claim." Well, I kept him froze, for in spring I knew I'd have to look for that claim. It was up Pemagon Creek, which was try to trek by dog sled and canoe. And there by the light of the midnight sun I searched and I searched for that claim. But the hole was sloughed in, and I couldn't be sure just where Hard Luck had been. But I knew I was close to the place in that barren waste, so I planted him good and deep. Now on a winter night by the aurora light, I can still see that man's face. And no man I've known will ever hold a candle to Hard Luck McLean. The Pill. There's a lot of talk these days about trimming our national debt. How they're going to balance the budget hasn't been figured out yet. They'd like to cut Social Security, but they don't seem to dare. To get around this, they're working on Medicare. Medical costs keep going up. It's enough to make you cry. You can't afford to go to the hospital, and you can't afford to die. I go to see my doctor. My gizzard's on the blink. He says, I'm going to change your medication. We have something better now, we think. But one thing about it, to be alive gives me a thrill, and I feel so much safer since I've been on the pill. Toilet tissue. I wrote this as a formal issue about the size of the hole in the middle of the bathroom tissue. By the size of the hanger that holds the roll, there seems to be no object or goal. But knowing human nature with all its greed, there's a reason for this, yes indeed. The size of the roll is the same around, but a lot less sheets in the roll are found. The price has gone up, but the quality's not there, and the ones who are making it don't seem to care. So let this be a warning to all mankind. Someone is trying to get us in a bind.